In the summer and fall of 2012, the attention of the world, it seemed, was riveted to a small town in Spain. A small town of less than 5,000 people called Borja. You see, it seemed that somebody in Borja had made a mistake. And not just any mistake, mind you. It was a huge, colossal mistake, a mistake so large that it was like nobody could turn away. You see, in that town of Borja, there was a church, a traditional Roman Catholic church. And in that church, as in many similar churches, there were a number of pieces of traditional artwork. One of them was a fresco that had been painted in the early 1930s by a visiting artist. It depicted what is called in Roman Catholic art the Ecce Homo, which is Latin for behold the man. It is a depiction of Jesus Christ crowned in thorns as he appears before Pilate just before being sent off to be crucified. The painting was quite beautiful according to the standards of that traditional artwork when it was first painted in the 1930s. But by 2012, the fresco was in a terrible state of affairs. Due to the dampness in the walls of the church, the paint had faded and flaked away, so the painting was in a terrible state. It looked awful, it really did. And the painting was in such a bad state that one of the members of that parish, a woman over 80 years old by the name of Cecilia, was terribly distraught. But she understood that the church did not have the money to attempt what would be a very expensive restoration of the art. Cecilia was an amateur artist. She decided that she would help her church. She would donate her time and effort, and she would fix the painting herself. The result of Cecilia's work is what everyone hailed as a terrible mistake. Because yes, she really did botch the job. And people criticized Cecilia brutally. And it hurt. I mean, it really did. Cecilia was deeply hurt. She fled the church. She fled social life. She hid in her house for several weeks and refused to come out. During this season of Lent this year, I wanted to talk about and focus on mistakes and what they do in the life of the church. And I think that this rather famous mistake is a wonderful place to start. Because it is absolutely a mistake. It was wrong. It should never have happened. It was not intentional. All evidence seems to indicate that Cecilia meant well. She only wanted to help. She only gave her best effort. But yeah, it was a mistake. What does that teach us about mistakes and what they do in the life of the church? I'm actually kind of struck as I consider this story about the contrast between these two artists. We have two artists who worked on this same piece. The original artist was Elias Garcia Martinez. And in the early 1930s, he was a visiting professor from an art school. And he describes the work that he did in that church like this. At the time he wrote that the Ecce Homo was the result of 2 hours of devotion to the Virgin of Mercy. What I understand by that was that he was visiting the church, he saw the empty spot, and out of a desire of devotion to So he spent a couple of hours painting the fresco. But it was a gift, and it was an act of devotion. The interesting thing for me is that Cecilia also describes what she did as an act of devotion. It was out of her devotion to her church, to the Virgin Mary, that she wanted to do this thing. And there was no lack in her devotion. And she put in the time, and she put in the effort. She probably put in more time and more effort than did the original artist. So she did not lack in desire, she did not lack in hard work. What she lacked in, of course, was skill. She did not have the talent or the skill of the original author. But both were given as acts of devotion. Which is worth more? Is the devotion of the artist worth more because of his superior talent and skill? Or does the pure heart and the best of intentions of Cecilia count for anything? These are very good questions. The fact of the matter is that mistakes happen. It happened in the life of the church. We read just a few minutes ago from the letter of James that everybody makes mistakes, and it is absolutely true. And mistakes cause damage in the life of the church. But I'm not really thinking about the damage that is caused by our mistakes. I mean, yes, sometimes when we make mistakes, it causes damage. But often it seems to me that the greater damage comes from our reaction to those mistakes. And look at what happened to Cecilia. She was deeply hurt. She was devastated. She was hurt. How often does that happen in the life of the church? And I'm not suggesting even for a moment that people have no justification for their complaints or their recriminations. I mean, look at what this woman had done. She had actually destroyed an irreplaceable work of art. To assess the monetary damage that was caused by what some would call her act of vandalism would be nearly impossible. Yes, people could justifiably complain about it. But just because you can complain justifiably, does that mean that you always should? And does that mean that you should do it in a way that hurts other people? And that's a very important question to ask in any context, but I think it is especially important to ask in the life of the church. Because the church is supposed to be a place of grace. And it seems to me that the people in Cecilia's parish were somewhat lacking in grace towards her. But here's the rather amazing thing in all this story. Someone clearly did not lack in grace. Someone never lacks in grace. Because here's the story. The story of what happened in Borja, Spain does not end with Cecilia's mistake and everybody's negative reaction. There's more to the story. We actually know about what happened in 2012 in Borja because of something that you may have heard of. It's called the internet. And because of the internet, it is now quite possible for the whole world to become aware of something that happens in a small town in Spain. And that's what happened. The story got shared. It became well known, and all of a sudden, before you knew it, Cecilia Cecilia's artwork was found everywhere. Everyone was paying attention to it. And yes, they were mocking it. They were laughing. They were making fun of Cecilia. Absolutely, they were. They were calling her a fool. But then something else started to happen. And I'm sure that at first it was a bit of a lark. People said, why don't we go over to Borja? Why don't we go and see what Cecilia did? We'll laugh, we'll take selfies, we'll post them on the internet. And then, before you knew it had become a thing. And people began to flock to Borja, actually from all over the world. And all of a sudden, this small town of Borja, which had actually been teetering on economic collapse for quite some time, found itself in the midst of a boom in tourism. The town was saved from economic ruin. And not just the town, of course, the church decided early on that there would be no harm in charging people just a little bit of money to come into the church and take their selfies with Cecilia's picture. And people didn't mind paying. So the church itself was also saved from a great deal of financial ruin. Some wonderful things came out of this great mistake that Cecilia did. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, lays out a principle that I think illustrates what happened with Cecilia and her art restoration. The Apostle Paul writes this: God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. You see, we all have our plans. We lay our plans. We come up with schemes and ways of improving and achieving our goals. And they could have done that for Borja. They could have come up with this wonderful economic plan to revive the town of Borja. And in fact, there were, in the early 2010s, there were people who were working on that. An economic revival for Borja. And somebody could have come up with a plan to revive that parish church in Borja. You know, they could have brought in the high-powered, expensive consultants to look at that church and come up with a plan to revive that church. People lay their plans. And sometimes God blesses those plans. God prospers those plans because God desires good things to happen for towns and for churches and for peoples. But if it had happened like that, if Borja had been revived by some urban planner's idea about what to do for the economy, if the church had been revived by the work of some high-powered consultant, who would have got the glory? I'll tell you. The planners, the strategists, the politicians who came up with the ideas and paid for them. And that's why, according to Paul's letter to the Corinthians, God often prefers, instead of blessing the work of the high-powered planners and strategists, bless the work of the Cecilias of the world. People who set out with the best of intentions and kind of screw up and get it all wrong. Because then, when as a result you have this wonderful blessing, this great thing, who can you? Who can you give the glory and the credit to if not God? God loves to work that way. God loves us to surprise us by bringing grace out of our mistakes. And that's why I think I've seen it again and again in the life of the church that we come up with our plans. We come up with our strategies. We're going to do this, and it's going to lead to this and this and this. And it never works out. Never works out exactly as we planned. At some point in the process, something goes off the rails. Something goes wrong, and we throw up our hands and we are ready to despair. But you know what happens? Later on, when we look back at it, we realize that it was at that moment when things went off the rail, when our plans went awry, when something went wrong, that something came out of it that was the best thing about it at all. I've seen that happen again in the life of the church. Because God loves to surprise us with grace. Even when we get it wrong. Sometimes, especially when we get it wrong. That's what grace is actually all about. I believe that in the church we have a mistakeophobia. We have an irrational terror of mistakes. We're afraid of making mistakes. And that destroys us in all kinds of ways. For one thing, it makes us afraid to even try. To try something that is new, that is different, that unfamiliar. We're afraid of making mistakes, so we won't even try it. And how much has that held back the church over the centuries? Knowing that God loves to bless the Cecilias of the world, that God loves to show us His grace through our mistakes, actually gives us this incredible freedom to just go out and try something, do something different, and yeah, it may not go as we think, but it will create an opening for God to show us His grace. We ought not to be afraid of trying something new because we will probably make a mistake. Because of God's grace. Of course, the other negative thing that comes out of our mistakeophobia is how we treat one another. And we do, yes, have this tendency, when people in the life of the church make mistakes, to jump on them and to be critical. And I hope the story of Cecilia reminds us just how devastating that can be. This poor woman who only meant well sees that as the darkest time of her life. Because of our fear, our dread of mistakes, yes, we are very hard on one another sometimes. The thing that does to the church is it changes the church from a place where we build one another up to a place where we tear one another to pieces. And I know that God never blesses that. Never. So my challenge to you, to me, to all of us is simply this. The next time you see a mistake, see yourself make a mistake, the next time you see someone else make a mistake, don't do what comes naturally. Don't respond with that mistakeophobia. Learn to respond with grace. See it as a challenge. God is challenging you to find in that mistake His opening for grace. So we have a God who brings grace out of everything. That's what makes Him so amazing. Take a few moments in silence.